Hi, everybody. Welcome to our discussion of Blowout. I'm here with Jennifer Fleeger. I hope each of you saw her wonderful introduction with actual location filming, which, you know, sets a bar that, well, I just recorded an intro for next week, and I know I sure didn't meet that. Anyway, uh, we are looking forward to discussing Blowout with you. For those of you who aren't familiar with our format here, we are going to ask you to please keep your audio on mute unless I call on you to ask your question or make your comment. How will I know to call on you? You will use the raise hand function within Zoom. And then I will call on you and you can ask your question or make your comment, and then Jennifer and I will respond. And it's pretty much that simple. You can also ask the other participants their thoughts on different things or make different points in the chat using the chat function. Our colleague Jill is monitoring that, and if any hot button issues come up there, she'll be sure to let me know to bring them up to the larger discussion. And we are always interested in knowing where folks are from, especially if they're joining us from outside of the general Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania area. So please feel free to introduce yourself on the chat and say where you're from. We also have a Where in the World feature on the Film Studies Online part of our website, where you can fill out a form and let us know where you're from and let us know what you think of our programs. Finally, I should mention we have some seminars coming up on Tuesday nights. Tomorrow night is the first one. I am teaching that one. And 2 weeks from tomorrow night, my co-moderator this evening, Jennifer Fleeger, is teaching one on the origins of sound in Hollywood, which is based in part on a book she wrote on a related topic. So we've got some great programs coming up on some Tuesday nights through the summer and into the fall, and we are going to keep doing these discussions as well. But tonight we are here to discuss Blowout, and I would encourage anybody with questions or comments to please raise their hand in the within Zoom. I can see right now that we don't have any questions or comments. Oh, there's one, but before we get to that one, I will, oh good, they're starting to populate. That's great. We did get a question online asking whether the big Liberty Bell Day celebration and parade at the climax of the movie was an actual event or was staged. And it was staged. It was made for the production. And in fact, a couple of reels of the film, of that portion of the film, were stolen off the truck that was transporting the footage from Philadelphia back to Los Angeles. So they actually had to reshoot that portion of the film using insurance money at a cost of about $750,000. So not only did they stage the parade, they kind of staged it twice. So those are the rigors of, at the time, medium budget filmmaking. So there you go. Let's see. Let's start off for our first question or comment with David.
Good evening, and thank you for letting me start. We really enjoyed the film, and I think that the film had so many different aspects that led us and helped us enjoy it. There were scenes that were just reminiscent of other films. Seeing Philadelphia was just a wonderful sight, and they did a very good job of making sure that those of us from the Philadelphia area recognized it. I thought the acting was just fun and over the top at the same time. I thought that the acting was just slightly more than needed, which was exactly what this film really did want. When there was music, it built to nice points. I think on balance, it was just a really well-balanced, well-done film. I'd like somebody, one of the two moderators, just comment on the music, because I always like to hear other people's views on how it's done. Thank you again for doing this.
Sure. Jennifer, I will let you take that comment on the music because that is a specialty of yours. So your thoughts on the music in this film?
I mean, I think there's a variety of musical types, which makes it quite fun. The chase music, which uses the guitar and other more contemporary instruments. But my favorite is the Sally and Jack theme that I mentioned in the intro. And there, I think there's a kind of Italian sound to it. I think I said that too, by Pino Donaggio. He did more than 200 film scores, so he was really quite experienced. And that tune, I can still hear it in my head. And I feel emotional when I hear it, even though I know, the over the top thriller, all of the meta commentary on filmmaking here that happens in this film. I think it's quite beautiful, especially when it's done.
Yeah, I would agree. I find it interesting that at least for certain portions of his career, De Palma went to Italian composers. I know he used Ennio Morricone, at least on The Untouchables, and I think he used him on one or two other movies as well. And I think that there's something, I think different, countries and different societies have sort of different views about sort of what film music should be in some cases. And I think the Italian film industry is in many ways different from Hollywood, particularly when it comes to its use of sound, that I feel like there's a bit of sort of kind of critical distance with an Italian composer that you wouldn't necessarily get with a film like this and a composer either from the US or from other countries as well. And I feel like, David mentioned something about the music having a sort of almost like a sort of a different quality to it. And I know Jennifer, you did as well, that it's almost like the music's kind of self-aware in a way.
Yeah, I think what you just said is so brilliant, Andrew, because there's something about this film in which everything is on the surface. And that's how Italian film sound works too, in which it's all post-synchronized. So there's always like a sheen of sound. We don't hear a lot of depth. It's all surface dubbing. And the music is often like that too, even in neorealism, where there's this melodramatic, almost operatic quality to the music. It's excessive, just like everything else in this film. And because De Palma is calling so much on the Italian giallo for the bright red of the blood and the neon reds and greens throughout the movie and blues, it's based on that kind of Italian slasher film genre that we get this kind of color scheme. So it makes sense that he uses that musical style as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think the emphasis on surface is a really good point, because it doesn't mean the film is shallow, but it's really definitely putting a focus or on this outer layer. Absolutely. Let's see. Faeze, you have a question or comment?
Yes, good evening for both of you. Why do filmmakers repeat certain themes? Or I mean, is it homage to the other filmmakers who've made things like this? Like in this case, I guess we were told Antonioni and Coppola. Is it because they want to mess with the same techniques? Is it that the theme is so intriguing that it's worth re-examining over and over again? Why does that happen in cinema, especially when it's borderline art films like this one?
Okay, Faeze, thank you for a very thoughtful question. I think to some extent, the answer depends on the filmmaker, right? I think there are some filmmakers that we can either sort of deduce from their other movies or from their comments, their own interviews, or we sort of assume based on the type of work they do that different filmmakers have different levels of depth to the homages that they I don't know what you would say use, I guess, but I think with De Palma, because and you actually hinted at this in your question, because De Palma is basically, primarily an art filmmaker, and that's probably one of the reasons why this film wasn't more successful with audiences and even to an extent critics when it came out, because expectations were set that it was going to be a sort of more mainstream political thriller, when really I think De Palma is sort of using those generic elements to explore other themes, some of which have to do with the processes and experiences of filmmaking. And so De Palma, more so than a lot of filmmakers, is known for his homages to Hitchcock and to other filmmakers. And I think, unlike some people, like, I'll just say, come out and say it, Michael Bay, whose movies I enjoy, but I don't think there's a tremendous amount of depth to. I think he sees the way something looks, he likes the way it looks, he uses it. I think De Palma puts more thought into it than that. And I think he doesn't just think about how it looks. I think he thinks about how it functions and how it works on the audience and what the technique meant when the original filmmaker used it originally, and how and why he's sort of making a comment on it by using it himself in a different situation. Jennifer, your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think that's great. Film is an art, and so artists become obsessed with certain themes because we're humans and we all have certain kinds of concerns. So I think after this coronavirus crisis is over, we're going to see a lot of films that deal with what it means to be isolated and afraid, and what it means to have your society seemingly break down around you. Just like after the Second World War, from European countries, we saw filmmakers who were very invested in the idea of, I don't really know what to do. Here I am in a landscape. How do I move forward? So what we're interested in reflects our times. But in this film, and I saw a question in the chat come in as I'm talking. I can only see the first few words of each chat, but somebody asked about the overhead shots. And so those are definitely a reference to the conversation, which begins with a massive overhead shot of a big plaza in San Francisco, and then takes about 4 or 5 minutes to track in and finally focus on what we're looking at, and also ends with an overhead shot of his apartment, and moving the camera back and forth across the apartment space over and over again. So De Palma is interested in themes like, as I said in the intro, authenticity and artifice, because he's interested in those themes. And he gets at them by paying homage to certain filmmakers like Hitchcock or Coppola, or Antonioni, all three of them here.
Yeah. Let's see. Lilyan, you had a question or comment. Okay.
Yes, no, I'm here. I'm here.
Go ahead.
I had to unmute myself. I just want to say, I found this one of the most riveting movies I've seen in a long time. I don't know how I missed it somewhere along the way, but, and I'm not a great movie watcher at home person. I really prefer to be in a theater, but I didn't budge. I didn't budge during this movie. And I watched it Saturday night. I watched it Sunday again, and I felt exactly the same way. I thought this was a great film.
That's awesome.
we're glad to hear that. Do you have any sense, can you say something specific that you found so engrossing, or why you think you thought this was more engrossing than other movies you've seen?
It was tight. You kept hoping everything would be all right and almost knowing it wasn't going to be all right. There were so many things happening in this film at the same time. The Philadelphia stuff was wonderful. It just as a whole package, I thought John Travolta was terrific. And as far as Nancy Allen, I think she played who she was supposed to be. I thought she was wonderful.
Well, thanks very much, Lilyan. Yeah, I'm always curious, just for myself, why I find certain movies more engrossing than others. And one commonality I've found, and I think it may apply here, because I also, find this film particularly engrossing, is a sense, when I get the sense as a viewer that the filmmaker has tremendous intentionality in what he or she is doing, that the things that I am seeing have not been chosen purely or primarily out of convention or out of convenience, but that I am seeing a tracking shot of a particular type or duration or location because the filmmaker wants to put me in a certain frame of mind for the events that are unfolding or about to unfold. I mean, how many times have we seen a creepy guy follow an unsuspecting woman in a movie? We've seen it a million times. But when at 30th Street Station, when the John Lithgow character sort of, sets his sights on the prostitute he's going to add to the sort of list of decoys, so to speak. It's very sort of purposeful and methodical in the way he stalks her and follows her, and that the character's method and purpose and focus comes through in the choices of the filmmaking, in the cinematography and other choices. And so when there's that much effort put into how a moment is depicted, and that's done consistently throughout the film, you know, to me, I find that riveting, because I don't know whether it's, I feel like the filmmakers put in all this thought, I owe him or her my attention, or whether it's, this is not a typical choice, so I want to see what's going to happen next, or what choice is going to be made next. I'm not sure what it is, but for me, that's part of it. Seeing things happen in different ways, I find engrossing. Jennifer.
I completely agree with you with the connection with character. And I also think when De Palma reveals himself, that's when I start to think more about filmmaking and why do filmmakers do things and what do they mean? So an example of that for me is when we're in the workshop with Travolta and the camera does that 360-degree pan. I don't know how many times. It's really annoying. I hate it. But as I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, okay, why is he relying here on Coppola from conversation? What does it mean to change that, the difference between this and this motion? It reminded me of Godard's Weekend. Why do I hate this so much? Why am I spinning around this room? And then I start to think about the theme of spinning and dizziness and circularity. And I like that my brain is moving in a different direction than the film is going. I'm not able to get completely absorbed. I'm constantly thinking about other things. So to me, it's absorbing, but in a different way, like Andrew's describing, because our minds are working constantly as we're watching. And that's a wonderful feeling, you know?
Yeah, and the other thing I would say is that people who've taken classes with me before have heard me say this a million times, but some of you haven't, so I'll say it again, that one of the hardest things for a filmmaker to convey is character interiority. What is a character thinking or feeling inside himself or herself? And the sort of cliche way to do this is with a voiceover, and that is almost never done well. But when you can do something with the camera or with the sound or with the composition to give us a sense of what a character is feeling, that's really thoughtful filmmaking. And I think the moment you were just referring to, Jennifer, of Travolta going through all that footage as seeing if there's anything salvageable as the camera sort of spins around the room, that does all the things you said it did, but it also gives us a sense of what his character is feeling. And that is something that when a filmmaker can do it, I find that riveting, because it is rare, in large part because it is hard to do. Let's see, Robert, your question or comment?
Oh, thanks a lot. When I saw it for the first time, which I just did, and before I heard Jennifer's introduction, the first thing that came to my mind was this had to be extremely influenced by the film Blow Up. This is Blow Out, and the other one's Blow Up. I mean, so I immediately just stopped doing everything, and I saw the Blow Up right after I saw Blow Out. Anyway, so I just would like you guys, if you could talk about what are the similarities and differences between Blow Out and Blow Up, and what techniques did Antonioni bring to Blow Up that De Palma brought to Blow Out, and what were the differences? And was De Palma greatly influenced by the films of Antonioni? And from what I understand about Antonioni represents the new wave, if I'm not mistaken. You guys can correct me. So I guess there must be new wave aspects in this film that we're studying tonight. such as location. Everything's on location, like the city of Philadelphia, and Antonioni's pictures are all on location in these little Italian cities on the streets. So anyway, thank you.
Okay, well, you gave us a lot to kind of tackle there, Robert. We'll try to do our best. Regarding location, I don't think in 1981 in Hollywood we can talk too much about location shooting being kind of a conscious choice of a movement. It was pretty standard for Hollywood movies to be shot on location by then. And while I wouldn't say that De Palma was a member of any sort of new wave, he was one of the early and older members of the generation, the first, major sort of significant generation of cine-literate filmmakers that are, I think, sometimes dismissively called the movie brats. People like Coppola and Lucas and Scorsese and Spielberg and John Milius and De Palma. And the reason they're thought of as sort of the first generation of, very cine-literate filmmakers is for a couple of reasons. One is many of them went to film school, at least for some training or school or education. Not all of them did, and certainly not all of them graduated. The other reason is they were the first generation of filmmakers raised with television, and television was a place in the 50s and 60s to see a lot of Hollywood movies in a way that no previous generation had had access to in terms of diversity and frequency of screening. The last thing I would say is they're also the first generation to have had access to at least a reliable stream of European art cinema being shown in the US. It wasn't as accessible as it is today, but if they were in a college town or in a big city, there would have been either a theater or a film society that was routinely showing some European art cinema. So all of those things became part of their cultural awakening and their development as artists. And that is certainly true with De Palma. I think that one of the big differences between De Palma and Antonioni is that De Palma is much more interested in sort of clear, I won't say direct, but clear and recognizable homages to specific films and filmmakers. I don't think of Antonioni as having that similar preoccupation. I also think that, sort of swinging London, London in the mid 1960s and the United States at the very end of the 1970s after Vietnam and Watergate are two sort of very different cultural moments. But that being said, he was certainly influenced by that film and others, as Jennifer has demonstrated. Jennifer, your thoughts on some of Robert's questions?
I mean, they both deal with the same theme, trying to discover the truth of a crime and being unable to actually do anything about it. So this kind of sense of the inevitability of actions in your world moving on without you, and you can't control them anymore. The hero that was in American films prior to the Second World War, who could move through and take action and accomplish goals. We don't see that in either of those two films. I think the other thing that strikes me a lot about the two films is both male characters' investment in total superficiality, like the photographs that he takes of the young girls in Blow Up. I don't like watching those scenes today. And then seeing at the very beginning of Blowout, it's a mockery of those kind of movies, right? Travolta is not proud that he's making these things. And that's why we get the silly titles that he rattles off at the beginning of the film. So their investment in something that's clearly not really living up to their potential, and then their inability to reach the potential in digging for the truth, is something that's similar in both films. And then of course the endings where we don't achieve what we hope to achieve in either case. Although I kind of wish we had some mimes playing tennis in this movie. It's unfortunate that we don't, but yeah. So all of those things are similar, but you're right. Antonioni being a European art filmmaker, he's not as worried about genre as De Palma is. He takes the American idea of genre and puts it together with European art cinema. And that's where we get this everything on the surface kind of thing, which is fascinating.
But you made a really interesting point there, Jennifer. The idea that, because it's so common now, I mean, it's almost the default setting that your movie is going to have a protagonist that a male protagonist that is not prepared to handle the challenges that are coming his way, that is not equipped to overcome the obstacles, is complete anathema to Hollywood in the 30s, 40s, and most of the 50s as well. And it's not every movie now, but it's a lot more common now. And that's something those two movies have in common, because in part, there's an implicit criticism, either of masculinity or of that approach to movie storytelling. Let's see. Meredith, you have a question or comment?
Hi. I do. I think this was the second time I've seen this film. And this time I was like, how can John Travolta not know that his phone is being tapped? He just is someone who should understand all these technologies of surveillance. And that kind of really and how can he send her into the station knowing what happened to Freddie Corso, right? So this led me to think about this kind of theme of innocence and naivete. And I just kind of wonder what you think about this. It seems like the people who are suspicious and paranoid and kind of degraded are also innocent at the core. And to me, this is nowhere obvious than when the sex worker is brushing her teeth, So I just wondered if you could comment on that. I feel like there is some sort of commentary on human nature going on here in such a degraded environment that these people are still innocent and naive.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good observation, and a really thoughtful insight about human nature in general, but this film's sort of take on it. I think that I appreciate that, particularly that you chose to see what some people would simply see as a convenient sort of plot, hole or logic hole. It has some rationale to it, but I think there's evidence to support that it does. I mean, if we sort of follow the nature of this political allegory that has been laid out as one of the many elements of the film, then there is certainly a case to be made that Travolta is a stand-in for the American electorate, for the sort of general American public. And we have, you could make the case certainly over the course of the last several decades that just when we thought we had gotten sort of cynical enough and we had lowered our opinion of the of politicians enough, that the floor keeps sort of falling. And in a way, that's what's happening with that character. And in some ways, that's his fatal flaw, because for all of his paranoia and all of his suspicion of these people, and for all of his determination to do it right, he's completely out of his depth. And of course, that's what happens, right? I mean, if you're not a thoroughly devious, or in the case of John Lithgow, deviant person, then you can't possibly fathom what such a person is capable of. And I think the film is saying that about the Travolta character as an individual. And I think there's some commentary there on what it says about, most of us as the American public. Jennifer.
I think it's exactly what makes it different than Antonioni or Harry Call in Conversation, or even Jimmy Stewart in Vertigo. He's absolutely naive, and you see it at the first questioning of the policeman, how he sits there and talks so conversationally with him in the most adorable, honestly way. And the same with Sally's character. It's very sweet, and I think it invests us in the story, but it's also what makes it a Philadelphia film. Because typically the Philadelphia hero is very similar to this. It's somebody who doesn't seem to achieve very much. They just want to make it all the way through the movie, basically. If you think of Rocky or Silver Linings Playbook, all of these characters have that same kind of naivete. They just want to get a 5 on their dance competition. A 5 is enough, or go the distance. And it's the same here. If he could just get to the end of the movie and put the thing on TV, he doesn't want to be rich or famous. He just wants to get the thing on TV, and make everything okay. And yeah, I think it's partly an homage to that genre of Philadelphia movies too.
Yeah, that's so interesting, right? The modest expectations or aspirations of the Philadelphia protagonist. I smell a conference paper. Let's see. Janice, you had a question or comment. Okay, we can come back to Janice. Mike. Oh,
I'm here.
Okay,
I'm
Janice,
having trouble unmuting. I don't know
okay,
why.
go ahead, Janice.
Sorry about that. I watched this movie. It was a movie that was unusual for me, and I was riveted and I loved it. And many times I noticed that we have conversations about other things that were made by that particular person. So I decided to watch Carrie after that, just to have a basis for comparison. And what struck me immediately was how both of them began with pictures of very young, beautiful, naked women. And I know we view these things differently now, but I wondered if that was typical of Brian De Palma, or if it was just I happened to watch the two movies that started that way.
Well, I think it's fair to say that Brian De Palma is more comfortable with nudity and sexuality and the juxtaposition of those things with violence than almost any other filmmaker who's also directed a Tom Cruise movie. So I think there is some consistency there across his work. I think that, you know, in this film, it's posited as being satirical, but one also can't ignore the sort of, even if he's making fun of it, it still serves the same crass commercial purpose. So I don't think he gets sort of a walk in that regard. But yeah, I don't think the sort of feeling you came away with is wrong about him. Jennifer?
Yeah, I'm with you, but I also have to say I love how many people went out and did extra homework in order to prepare for the conversation. That's just really wonderful. I mean, you're right, Andrew. It's one of those moments where I felt this way about a lot of shows on HBO sometimes. I know they're making a critique of the thing that they're making a critique of, whether it's how we treat women or excessive violence in society. But in order to make that critique, we're still looking at how we treat women or excessive violence at the same time. And so there's times in which you feel kind of uncomfortable with doing the critique in this way. The silliness of the opening of this movie doesn't make me too uncomfortable because it's so over the top ridiculous that college students would be partying like this and all the time, and that we would be looking at these kinds of scenes. So, but yeah, in order to see it, we have to imagine that De Palma had that idea of how he wants to open his movies, which is true.
Yeah, and I also think it's fair to point out that, you know, that sort of slasher, slasher film that he's mocking at the beginning there was enormously popular in the late 70s and early 80s with Halloween and the Friday the 13th and those sorts of things. And so, I mean, those movies seem very passé to us nowadays, and for in some cases for good reasons. But at that time, that was, you know, those were mainstays of the industry. So it was much more sort of on topic, so to speak, than it might seem today. Lisa, you have a question or comment?
Hello. I am delighted that you guys chose this film. And I'm also really impressed at everyone's restraint up to this point and not just immediately asking about the ending, because every time I watch this ending, it jolts and shocks me every time. I love the ending. I find it troubling though, so I'm very curious how you both view it. I tend to view it in the purely thematic realm where the film is kind of commenting on how this true moment of emotion and anguish and truth can just be absolutely perverted by its use. But I'm so curious to hear what you guys think of the ending.
Jennifer, I think I'll let you take this one first.
That's a fantastic comment, because if we're thinking about this as a commentary on the slasher genre, at the end of a slasher movie, of course, we have the final girl who Carol Clover has defined this androgynous figure who survives and serves as the combatant for the slasher throughout the movie, right? And they come to terms and then she defeats him. So a lot of people have read slasher movies in spite of all this imagery as being kind of a feminist statement, because we have a character who can transcend that and who can battle the killer. And here Nancy Allen's character just, in fact, succumbs to the killer, really naively following him down to Penn's Landing and getting killed. And then that her scream gets used in the movie, which is, you know, that whole thing is ridiculous, right? Of course, anyone can produce a nice scream. We don't really need the search for the perfect scream. So the idea that we're going to take an actually murdered woman and use her in a terrible, ridiculous movie is crazy. You're right. Yeah, I'm with you. I almost don't know what to do with it, because it's the opposite of what we would want to happen with representations of women.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll talk about it sort of purely in terms of the film itself, and I think that this is a deeply cynical film, a film that is tired of what the decade of the 1970s unleashed on America in a socio-political, mostly political sense. And I think the end of the film is the way that the filmmaker feels and the character feels, and how they imagine, the filmmaker imagines we feel, which is just exhausted by all of the futility of what we've done. And I think the Travolta character is defeated, as he should be. I think he is morose, as he should be. I think he is punishing himself, which I don't know if he should be, but I think that the film is sort of saying the American people should be punishing themselves for continually making bad decisions. I think that it is, I mean, it's a tragedy. And I think that comes through. I think the fact that the one thing that the Travolta character had sort of always, that had always sparked him, which was his filmmaking, even when he was sort of embarrassed by the milieu in which he was working, he was excited about the sound and the capturing of the sound. I mean, he didn't have to go to the park in the middle of the night with all his equipment to accomplish to meet the standards of that producer or director. I mean, it's not clear to me what he was, but he wanted to, because he was really into that. And by the end of the film, he's lost even that sort of arena for joy. And I think that is that's extremely sad. And I think that the idea that, you know, that you don't have to go to such lengths for the perfect scream is in some ways a interesting analog for sort of the whole filmmaking process, right? All the things that these filmmakers do, all the things that De Palma does to make this film, whether it's staging the parade or the elaborate tracking shots or whatever, to try and get the audience to do a certain thing or have a certain reaction. I think, you know, and then at the end of it, feeling like you know, it was, if not all for nothing, that it was much more than what should have been required. I think there's a lot to that, and I think that I think it's a wonderful ending for this movie, but obviously not a wonderful ending for sort of like humanity.
It also goes to the number of films that are about stealing women's voices that came out around this time. So Dario Argento's Opera does this too, another Italian horror film, or Diva, that French film, which is about like a diva who doesn't want her voice to be recorded, and then somebody does record it and then crimes. And so there's a kind of conversation about how women's voices don't belong to them anymore that's happening in a rather expressive cinema. And I think De Palma's tapping into that with this ending too.
That's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that. Let's see. Mike, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I found that the further I got away from seeing this film originally, the more enjoyable it got. The Travolta character, this was really the first time John Travolta played a real adult role. And I've got to say, when I first saw it back in the 80s, all I could see was Vinnie Barbarino. And I just thought it was kind of a turning point in Travolta's repertoire of delivery. And just curious if you saw anything of that nature.
I'm sorry, what was that? Curious if we saw what?
If you saw the transition of him as an actor in this role.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, you're right. This is, I mean, I think he's like 27 or something by the time when this film is made. And I agree that after, you know, Grease and Saturday Night Fever, I never saw Urban Cowboy. I assume he was supposed to be an adult in that movie, but and that came out the year before this, but I don't think a lot of people saw that. I don't know. But I think it's actually really smart casting, because I think this character needs to have a believable sweetness and a believable naivete and a believable warmth. And I think that those are things that tend to be associated with younger people and younger characters. And so I think that casting someone who had spent so much time particularly playing characters with a considerable amount of naivete. I mean, he's not nearly as naive as some of those earlier characters he's played, but I think it works really well. But I had no trouble, you know, not thinking of Danny Zuko or not thinking of Vinnie Barbarino when I watched the film. But I think some of the qualities that made him good in those parts serve him well in this movie. Jennifer.
I think it's what gives the ending the added weight too. My favorite moment is actually when he's muttering to himself in the park saying it's a good scream. It's a good scream, over and over and over again. And that we know him for playing these young, naive parts. That moment is the growing up.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. Arlene, you have a question or comment? All right, Arlene, we can come back to you. Meredith, you had another thought to share.
Yeah, I did. I was thinking about all this Liberty Bell stuff. And I, you know, obviously, like, and I was just wondering, this is kind of going back to the gender question, if part of what De Palma is saying is like the liberty men can take with women's bodies has just gone too far, you know? Because I mean, I was just thinking about the Liberty Bell that's, you know, like carved into the woman's stomach, right? The first woman that he kills. And I was just thinking about this whole theme of individual liberties and, you know, the idea of American individualism and people being able to do whatever they want, you know? And I'm thinking, I may be wrong about this, but do Travolta and Nancy Allen not sleep together? Like, it's like we don't see them having any kind of sexual relationship, and it actually seems pretty chaste. Like when she, you know, like asked to go to a motel and she ends up like sleeping, you know, alone on the bed. So I was just wondering about this whole theme of liberties, and if you can comment on that a little bit more. And I guess I was thinking about it particularly in relationship to the treatment of women.
Well, thanks for that, Meredith. My understanding, based on some things I read, is that De Palma was interested in having that whole sort of Liberty Bell patriotic display because he was making a commentary on American political culture and things like that. And I would be surprised if De Palma were thinking about liberty in the regards that you mentioned it, certainly at that time, but just because he wasn't thinking about it consciously or purposefully doesn't mean that it didn't enter into the choices. And frankly, once the film is put out there, it's there to be read. And so I think it might be open to that, but I don't think that was his intention. Jennifer, your thoughts?
I think that the fact that Nancy Allen is his wife makes it a little bit more open to that possibility, because certainly I don't think he would want to suggest that Nancy Allen has no right to have her own agency or to move about freely in the world. So I would like to imagine that he's saying something like that, and with the critique of the beginning too. But I mean, it is Brian De Palma, so maybe not. At the same time, like the idea of liberty throughout the film, I think you're absolutely right that this is a huge theme, and red, white, and blue throughout the film is a huge way of articulating that. My favorite thing is the wallpaper in the motel with the beautiful, plaid red, white, and blue stripes. Every time they're standing next to each other, Nancy Allen's wearing blue or he's wearing red, or vice versa. Their clothing is this way. The neon signs are on them, and then he has to smash right through it in order to crash into the window and hang somebody, to ruin the idea of liberty and what we imagine liberty actually is as Americans, which is, as we see throughout the news footage in the film, covering over something that we're all going to invest in a story and not get to the truth. And that's why I think the split diopter shots are so important, because De Palma, when he uses those shots where both things are in the foreground at the same time, he allows us to have this kind of, as he calls it, a counterpoint with two ideas where we're going back and forth between one idea and the other. So with regard to liberty, the first time the newscaster is announcing the Liberty Day parade and the liberty events that are taking place, we see Travolta working next to that in his studio on his tapes. And we get the idea that maybe there's something behind all this that isn't the surface level of what we're seeing. And we have to put those things back and forth with each other all the time. So he's always asking us to think about two things at once and what everything really means.
Yeah, and your point about when he crashes into that store display, I mean, that appears to be a patriotic display of someone being hanged. No store in 1981 going to put in its window. Like, I know that, views of patriotism have changed and all that, but not in a department store in 1981. And so the idea, I mean, he's clearly chosen this liberty sort of setting, at least in part as a political, to facilitate political comment. But I think it's certainly open to other readings as well. And you and Meredith both made the good case for that. Let's see, Arlene, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I had several of them. First of all, about the ending, it sort of reminded me of how I felt watching Vertigo and having her die at the end. And I felt the same way when Nancy Allen died. Second of all, before I saw this film, I had previously seen Blowout, and then I had seen Sisters and Carrie and Dressed to Kill. And this weekend, I watched a documentary about De Palma, as well as watching Dressed to Kill again. So it sort of left me with a picture of De Palma and what he had been working with. And about the split screen, he had said that he did a lot of things in split screen, but found that to use it effectively, he only did that, included that when he felt it really worked.
Yeah, I think you're right. He actually, it's interesting because he does this sort of split diopter, which is what Jennifer was describing, with the two sort of things and equal prominence in the foreground at once. But he also does some actual split screen where you're watching sort of two separate shots unfolding on the screen at the same time. Those are devices that aren't commonly used in Hollywood cinema, and he's probably the most frequent user of both of them. And there have been some questions in the chat about the editing, and one of the things that those choices do is, remove some of the need for some of the editing, because you don't have to, make as many, you're not as limited in what you can show, and you can show things simultaneously without parallel editing. So in some ways that impacts the editing. But another thing you see in terms of the editing in this movie is something De Palma is known for, and again, not a lot of other filmmakers do, which is sort of, in a way, sort of like a trick or a surprise in the editing, like when the John Lithgow character kills the woman in the construction site. We're sort of tricked into thinking initially it might actually be Nancy Allen.
Yes, actually my sister, who watched this in a different location together with me, commented that at first she thought that the one being killed was Nancy Allen.
Right. So So he's not, I mean, he's not afraid, you know, the notion that the long-standing Hollywood notion for decades that all the choices filmmakers make, including the editing, should exist to make the story unfold clearly for the audience so the audience is never disoriented or confused, is clearly a memo that Brian De Palma is ignoring. And he, I mean, a lot of filmmakers are ignoring it to varying degrees by the 1970s, but he's really at the forefront of being willing to confuse and disorient and stymie the audience to a point. Jennifer.
Yeah, to go along with that and to address something I just saw in 5 words pop up in the chat about all the windows in the film. That serves the same purpose as well, I think. When we're seeing something through a window, like the window of the Wanamaker building or a window of a car or a window on the street, we're always aware that what we're looking at is a surface and that somebody has constructed that surface for us. And I think that De Palma is interested in doing that for us a lot. He does it with split screens too. Whenever there's a split screen, you become aware suddenly that somebody put those 2 images together for you. And you can no longer believe in the truth of what's behind them, but rather that it's a presentation. And so by putting windows all over the place, we become aware that somebody's presenting the image to us, but also that the critique he's making of American politics, that American politics is merely a screen that's being presented to us as a surface, and that there might be something else going on behind it, becomes clearer.
To me, it's indicative of one of the paradoxes of De Palma as a filmmaker, which is that I think he is so determined to affect and impact and the audience and to make the viewer feel what he wants them to feel when he wants them to feel it. But on the other hand, he's also so interested in all of these choices and techniques that draw attention to the fact that you're watching a movie, which is distancing. And so there's a bit of a kind of, it's hard to resolve those two. And in some cases, it might suggest that De Palma's kind of, you know, setting himself up he's giving himself a bigger challenge than he might need to otherwise by embracing those two sort of filmmaking considerations, seemingly to me in equal measure or something approaching it. Judy, you have a question or comment?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
If you could speak a little louder, that would be great.
Okay, yes, sure. I was just going to make a comment on your point, Andrew, about the futility that you sense at the end of the film. It is a film about making movies. I mean, that's certainly one of the subject matters. And I think it's very interesting that De Palma is almost critiquing the whole medium of filmmaking as something that in the end is frustrating or not worth the effort. I'm just wondering if you could comment further on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I think in part it relates to my last comment about sort of making the, you know, drawing attention to some aspects of the filmmaking, and that De Palma never tells his story as easily as he could. He is constantly setting up challenges for himself, and whether he's setting challenges up for himself in the characters he creates or the story he's chosen to tell, or simply in the matter of choosing to open a movie with a 3.5 minute tracking shot with, you know, a dozen speaking parts. He's never doing things as easily as he could. And I think that, you know, that's not a criticism. I think that's his approach to filmmaking, and he's also not shy about letting the audience know that and about making that visible perhaps more than other filmmakers do. And so I can imagine the sense of frustration that someone like him, we all undertake in our work or in our hobbies, you know, substantial endeavors. I mean, for crying out loud, Jennifer, you wrote a whole book, right? I wrote two. I'm sorry, Jennifer's written 2 books. I wrote a dissertation, which is sort of like half a book. And, lots of people have done lots of other things. And, so at the end of that process, you know all the sort of rush of emotions and feelings that are there, except I'll speak for myself. My dissertation was not written about positively or negatively in the New York Times, and it was not, people did not choose to buy a ticket or not choose to buy, or choose to not buy a ticket to it. And so as a filmmaker who sort of has set up the challenges De Palma has for himself, but still is obviously, because of the sandbox he is playing in, interested in some regard in at least a modicum of commercial and popular success, the frustration and futility at the end of a project must be substantial for someone like that. And I think that there is something, I think part of that weight, that, that sense of being, of everything being expended, that Travolta seems to bear at the end of the film, is probably not unlike what a filmmaker like De Palma feels after a film of his is released. Jennifer.
I think the critique of filmmaking in the film is connected to the character, and that John Travolta's character must pay for his crimes, for his mistake that he made helping out the police in that one instance. And so the killing of Nancy Allen's character is payment for that, and his psyche and his dealing with that. In other words, he can't escape into film. So he won't make better films than this because he's punishing himself for that mistake. And I think my feeling is that that De Palma might be saying the same thing to the American public with his movie. You don't get to escape into this either. I'm going to expose to you what your idea of America is really based on, and there's no escape in my movie. So one could imagine.
Very interesting. Let's see. Robert, did you have another question or comment?
Thank you. The more that I participate in our discussion today, the more I believe that this is just a very dark film, more than I thought before. I just want to add, not only do we have the opportunity for this man to become a true hero, just like we did in Blow Up, and they utterly fail, but I see both the protagonists in Blow Up and Blow Out. They're both experts in something. It's like these guys that one guy in Blow Up, he could play with a camera like it was an extension of his hand, the way he could manipulate that camera and touch it and hold it. And same with the Travolta character. He knew his way around those sound machines like they were just an extension of his hand. And they represent, the photography and the sound, to me, represent true scientific evidence. I mean, you cannot argue in a court of law, you cannot argue with a photograph. I mean, and you cannot argue with a sound tape that shows that there was a shot that came before the crash. Those are what I call scientific evidence. And yet in both films, these scientific evidence never saw the light of day. And it was defeated by the corruption of society. True science was defeated by the corruption of society. And it just makes me feel this is very dark. And also the fact that women there wasn't one, I didn't think that women were portrayed in a very intelligent light either, but that's different. Thank you.
Well, Robert, I think one of the points the film is making is that, being right or having proof or having the evidence or what have you isn't enough. It reminds me of a line from a completely unrelated movie that I really enjoy, a movie called Copland, which is that being right isn't a bulletproof vest, right? And having the facts and having the proof and having the evidence doesn't mean you're going to be able to stop the disaster or the tragedy or save the person. And that's that's life. That wasn't typically the movies for many decades, but that's life. And I think that that's part of, that's one of the many points of the film, I think. Jennifer, any last thoughts?
I think that Travolta's idea that if he got his footage on TV, that somehow that would be enough is actually part of his naivete. Because we have a long history in the American court system of analyzing photographs until they mean what they aren't, or analyzing video footage until it shows something that it doesn't show, or until that we get a acquittal for people who should be convicted. This has happened many, many times, as I'm sure we all know. And initially, when photographs get admitted into the courts, you had to have the photographer there to testify that that is the photograph of the thing that they saw. So we haven't always trusted machines, nor should we. There's a lot of deep fake technology now that we ought not to trust as well. So I took the idea that it's true. If he had brought this out into the public, he imagines that that will be enough and then that they will be safe. Would they, though? I mean, would we have believed it? We don't want to believe it. And I think that's part of what De Palma is saying throughout the movie. What do we really want to believe about America?
Well, thank you, Jennifer, very much for joining us and for suggesting this film and for your wonderful introduction, including location shooting and cast, additional cast as well, besides yourself. Please thank your fellow actor for us if it's not past his bedtime. If you have been interested in the discussion about sound and what Jennifer has to say on that topic and others, as you can see on the screen, on August 4th, she is giving a seminar about how sound came to Hollywood. And she's going to talk about some interesting, little known to most of us films and other sort of issues surrounding that emergence of sound. So consider please signing up for that. And tomorrow night, I am giving a lecture on a time in Hollywood history of dramatic change, basically 1965 to 1969, from The Sound of Music to Midnight Cowboy, what happened to Hollywood. And that will be tomorrow night at 6:30. You can find more about these seminars and others and all the other things we're doing at brynmarfilm.org. Check out the Film Studies Online section. If you sign up for our weekly emails, you'll get an email on Thursday that will tell you what the film we're discussing a week from tonight is and a link to its introduction. And there's a lot more going on at brynmarfilm.org. Theater 5, we have some great new virtual cinema films you can stream as well. So please consider visiting brynmarfilm.org and seeing all the stuff we have going on in film education and related to movies in general. And otherwise, thanks very much for joining us. We look forward to hopefully seeing you next week. And Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to your next introduction and discussion as well.
Awesome.
Take care, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.